The jeweler had sworn the diamond was indestructible, a stone forged in the deepest earth to withstand the weight of centuries. But as Duke Sebastian Hartwell stood in the churning mud of his own grand estate, clutching the gold band in his trembling palm, he realized that a single, quiet word from a woman's lips could shatter even the hardest diamond into 1,000 jagged pieces. The rain was a cold, relentless assault, soaking through the gold-trimmed navy velvet of his tailcoat and plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He didn't feel the chill. His entire sensory world had narrowed to the retreating sound of iron-rimmed wheels grinding against wet gravel. He watched the black horse-drawn carriage, the one bearing the Hartwell crest he had fought so bloodily to protect, vanish into the grey mist of the Derbyshire Valley. In the background, the palace stood as it always had, a fortress of grey stone and cold light, a monument to a lineage that reached back 400 years. Sebastian had sacrificed everything for those stones. He had bartered his soul, his reputation, and finally his hand in marriage to save the Duke from becoming a pauper. But as the carriage lights flickered one last time and died in the darkness, he was struck by a terrifying, hollow realization. He had the gold. He had the land. He had the title. And yet, standing in the muck of his own kingdom, Sebastian Hartwell was the poorest man in England. The ring in his hand seemed to glow with a cruel, mocking warmth. It was the only spark left in a world that had suddenly gone grey. Only moments ago, Charlotte had stood before him in the foyer, her floor-length silk gown a vision of ethereal grace against the oppressive opulence of the hall. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't wept. She had simply looked at him with eyes that were no longer searching for his approval, but were instead filled with a devastating, resolute clarity. "I have paid your debts, Sebastian," she had said, her voice a soft blade that cut through his pride more effectively than any insult. "I have polished your silver, managed your staff, and kept the wolves from your door while you treated me like a ghost in your halls. You married me to save your title. Well, it is saved. And now I am leaving you to enjoy it in the silence you so clearly prefer." She had placed the ring on the mahogany side table, a small metallic clink that had sounded like a funeral knell, and walked toward the door. Now the rain washed the salt of his tears into the corners of his mouth. He looked at the palace, then at the empty road, and finally at the ring. For a year, he had told himself that Lady Charlotte Fairleigh was a replacement, a temporary necessity, a merchant's daughter meant to fill a hole in the ledger. He had built a wall of ice around his heart, convinced that his noble blood made him untouchable. But as the sparks from the carriage's lanterns faded entirely, the wall collapsed. The fire of his sudden, frantic passion met the cold reality of his actions, and the resulting steam blinded him. He began to run. He didn't care that his white lace cravat was ruined or that his polished boots were sinking into the filth. He ran toward the gates, the ring gripped so tightly in his fist that the metal bit into his skin. He had spent a lifetime trying to save a title that couldn't love him back. He had finally realized, too late, that the only woman he couldn't replace was already gone. The transition from the rain-soaked present to the memory of a year ago felt like the strike of a match in a darkened room. Before the mud and the tears, there was the suffocating silence of the Hartwell study. It was a room that smelled of ancient paper, expensive tobacco, and the rot of a dying empire. Sebastian sat behind the massive oak desk that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. In his hands, he held a stack of parchment that felt heavier than lead. They were notices of foreclosure, gambling debts run up by a predecessor who had loved the cards more than the crown, and interest rates that were currently devouring the Hartwell legacy at a rate of £50 an hour. The estate, with its sprawling gardens and 400 years of history, was no longer a home. It was a sinking ship. "The bailiffs will be at the gates by the end of the quarter, Your Grace," his solicitor had whispered earlier that morning. "Unless, of course, you find a way to inject a fortune into these accounts that the Hartwell name simply no longer possesses." Sebastian had stared at his reflection in the darkened window. He was a man of sharp, noble features and windswept hair, a man built for the battlefield or the ballroom, but he was currently a man trapped. His pride was a physical weight in his chest. To lose Hartwell Hall was to cease to exist. Without the title, without the land, he was nothing more than a ghost with a famous surname. He had spent his entire life being told he was the guardian of a flame, and now that flame was flickering out on his watch. He knew there was only one solution, and it was a bitter pill to swallow: a mercantile marriage. He needed the kind of wealth that didn't come from ancient land grants, but from the soot and steam of the New World. He needed the Fairleigh fortune. Lord Fairleigh was a man who had made millions in shipping and textiles, a man who had everything but a drop of blue blood. He had a daughter, Lady Charlotte, whose reputation was as spotless as her father's ledgers were full. To the public, it would look like a union of tradition and progress. To Sebastian, it was a business transaction, a cold-blooded trade of his prestigious name for her father's gold. When Charlotte was first brought into the study for their formal introduction, Sebastian didn't even stand to greet her. He remained seated, the shadows of the room clinging to his navy velvet coat like a shroud. He watched her through narrowed eyes. She was a vision of ethereal grace, dressed in a gown of white silk that seemed too delicate for the heavy, masculine atmosphere of the room. Her blonde hair was styled with a simplicity that spoke of a woman who didn't need jewels to command a room. But Sebastian chose to see that simplicity as a lack of refinement. "You understand why we are here, Lady Charlotte," Sebastian had said, his voice as cold as the stone walls surrounding them. He didn't offer a pleasantry, he didn't comment on her beauty. He spoke to her as if she were a line item in a ledger. Charlotte had stood her ground, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I understand that my father wishes for a title, and you wish for his treasury, your grace." "Precisely," Sebastian replied, standing up finally, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. "Let us not pretend this is a matter of the heart. I am marrying you to save my lands. You are marrying me to become a duchess. I will provide you with the status you require. And in exchange, your dowry will clear the Hartwell debts, but do not expect more than a formal arrangement. My heart is not part of the contract." He had expected her to flinch, to cry, or perhaps to offer some feminine plea for affection. Instead, Charlotte had looked him directly in the eye, her expression distant and resolute. "I am well aware of the price of admission, Sebastian," she said softly, though there was a hidden strength in her tone he was too arrogant to notice. "I will be your duchess, I will restore your house, but remember, a house is not the same thing as a home." Sebastian had merely smirked, reaching for his fountain pen to sign the betrothal papers. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully traded a hollow ring for a solid future. He didn't realize that in his haste to save the stones of his palace, he had just invited a woman into his life who would eventually become the only thing worth saving, and that by the time he realized it, he would be the one begging for a contract he had once treated with such cold disdain. The ink on the parchment was black and permanent, sealing their fates. As he watched her leave the room, he felt a surge of relief that the debt was paid. He didn't see the way Charlotte paused at the door, a small, sad shadow falling across her face. He was a duke who had saved his title, and he was too blind to see that he had just begun the process of losing his soul. The honeymoon period did not exist at Hartwell Hall. There was only a transition from the coldness of the contract to the silence of the reality. When Charlotte arrived as the new Duchess, the heavy iron gates groaned as if protesting her entry, and the servants, loyal to the memory of a more noble lineage, greeted her with bows that were technically correct, but emotionally vacant. Sebastian did not meet her at the carriage. Instead, he remained in the library, his nose buried in correspondence, acting as though the woman who had just signed away £500,000 to clear his family's name was nothing more than a new piece of upholstery. For the first few months, Charlotte lived like a phantom. She moved through the drafty, cavernous hallways of the estate with a quiet grace that should have been a comfort, but to Sebastian, it was a constant reminder of his own failure to provide for himself. He treated her like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, or worse, a servant whose presence was a necessary evil. At dinner, the table was a vast mahogany desert between them. He would speak of the hunt, the weather, or the grain yields to the air above her head, never once asking about her life or the merchant's world she had left behind. "Your Grace," she had ventured one evening, her voice like a soft bell in the tomb-like dining room, "the west wing roof is weeping. The tapestries will rot if the leaks aren't mended." Sebastian hadn't even looked up from his plate. "The estate manager handles such trifles, Charlotte. You need only concern yourself with your wardrobe and your social calls. That is what a duchess does. He didn't see the flash of hurt in her blue eyes or the way she tightened her grip on her silver fork. He didn't see her because he didn't want to see her. To acknowledge her was to acknowledge that he was bought and paid for. He retreated to his club in London or the solitude of his study, leaving her to wander the dusty, neglected rooms of a history that apparently had no place for her. But while Sebastian played the part of the brooding, untouchable aristocrat, Charlotte began to move in the shadows. She did not wait for his permission. Using her merchant-class pragmatism, the common business sense Sebastian so despised, she began to systematically dismantle the chaos of the Hartwell ledgers. While Sebastian was away, she spent her nights in the small morning room, lit only by a single candle, poring over the estate's books. She found the leaks, and they weren't just in the roof. She discovered decades of embezzlement by the estate manager, thousands of pounds lost to redundant staff, and a cellar full of vintage wine that was being sold out the back door by a dishonest butler. She didn't confront Sebastian with her findings. She knew his pride would never allow him to accept help from a trade girl. Instead, she acted with the surgical precision of a shadow. She dismissed the corrupt manager under the guise of his retirement and personally interviewed a replacement who owed her father a favor. She negotiated with the local tenants, lowering their rents slightly to ensure they could actually pay, which in turn stabilized the estate's long-term income. The house began to breathe again. The dust that had choked the grand ballroom for a decade was swept away. The weeping roof was mended by workmen who were paid on time for the first time in years. The gardens, once a riot of weeds, began to show the structured beauty of the Hartwell legacy once more. Sebastian noticed the changes, of course, but his arrogance provided him with a convenient delusion. He attributed the restoration to good luck or the sudden competence of his staff. He convinced himself that the Hartwell name was simply asserting its natural dominance over decay. He would pass Charlotte in the hallway, her white silk dress whispering against the stone floors, and offer her a curt nod. He didn't notice the ink stains on her fingertips or the exhaustion behind her ethereal gaze. To him, she was still the replacement, the placeholder who sat at the end of his table while he waited for his life to feel like his own again. He didn't realize that while he was busy protecting the image of the Duke, Charlotte was the one protecting the man. She was the silent foundation of his world, holding up the ceiling while he paced the floor, utterly unaware that the ghost he ignored was the only reason the walls hadn't crumbled around him. He was a man living in a masterpiece, too blinded by the signature on the frame to see the artist working tirelessly in the dark. The winter that followed was the harshest Derbyshire had seen in a generation, but the frost outside the palace walls was nothing compared to the glacial silence that settled within them. For Sebastian, the novelty of his restored fortune had birthed a new kind of arrogance. Now that the debts were paid and the estate was thriving, he felt he had fulfilled his end of the bargain. He moved through his days with the practiced indifference of a man who had successfully purchased his freedom and intended to use it to keep the world at arm's length. Charlotte remained his silent shadow, a vision of ethereal grace who sat at the end of his table and moved through his halls like a memory of a woman he hadn't quite met. She had become so adept at her role that she was almost invisible to him. He had grown used to the house running perfectly, to the fires being lit and the ledgers being balanced, never once pausing to wonder whose hand directed the symphony. The peak of his neglect arrived on a Tuesday, a day of bone-chilling wind and grey skies. Sebastian was occupied in his study, engrossed in a map of his newly reclaimed timber lands, when his valet mentioned offhandedly that the kitchen staff had prepared a small cake. Sebastian hadn't even looked up. He assumed it was for a local feast or a staff celebration. He didn't realize it was the first anniversary of their wedding, and more poignantly, Charlotte's 23rd birthday. He spent the morning in town, debating horse flesh at his club, and the afternoon shooting with neighboring lords who praised him for revitalizing his family's honor. He returned to Hartwell Hall late, his cheeks flushed with brandy and the thrill of social victory. He expected his dinner to be served, his slippers to be ready, and the house to be quiet. When he entered the dining room, he found Charlotte sitting alone at the far end of the long mahogany table. She wasn't eating. A single candle burned between them, its flame dancing in the draught. She was dressed in a gown of pale blue velvet, her blonde hair swept up with a delicate lace ribbon. She looked like a portrait of a duchess, yet there was a hollow stillness in her posture that made her look fragile, like fine porcelain left out in the cold. "You're late," she said softly. Her voice didn't carry the weight of an accusation, it carried the weight of a fact. "Business in town," Sebastian replied curtly, throwing his gloves onto a side table. The Earl of Pembroke was asking after the timber yields, a productive day. He sat down and began to eat the pheasant the footman placed before him, oblivious to the small, untouched parcel wrapped in silk that sat by Charlotte's plate. He talked for 10 minutes about his own successes, about the strength of the Hartwell name, and about how he had finally put things right. Charlotte watched him, her gaze fixed on the way the candlelight reflected in his dark, windswept hair. "Do you know what today is, Sebastian?" He paused, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. He searched his mind for a moment, looking for a fox hunt or a political meeting he might have missed. "Tuesday, the 7th. The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to dim the light in the room. Charlotte didn't cry. She simply stood up, her velvet skirts rustling like a sigh. "It is the anniversary of the day you saved your title," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it is the day I realized that to you, I am nothing more than a replacement for the debt you owed." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving the silk-wrapped parcel behind. When Sebastian finally opened it, driven by a sudden, inexplicable prick of guilt, he found a hand-knitted scarf of the finest wool, dyed in the exact navy blue of his favorite coat. It was a gift of time, effort, and observation, all the things he had denied her. He looked at the empty chair at the end of the table and felt a fleeting, cold shiver. For the first time, the palace felt too large, but he shook the feeling off, poured himself another glass of wine, and toasted to his own reflection. He told himself she was merely being temperamental. He told himself he was the Duke, and she was lucky to be there. He was a man who had everything, yet as the winter wind howled against the stone walls, he didn't realize that he was slowly freezing to death in a house filled with fire. The Royal Winter Gala at the St. James Estate was a whirlwind of shimmering silk, clinking crystal, and the kind of high-stakes gossip that could ruin a reputation before the first waltz ended. Sebastian moved through the ballroom with the predatory grace of a man who had reclaimed his throne. His navy velvet coat and gold-trimmed waistcoat caught the light of 1,000 candles, signaling to every noble in attendance that the House of Hartwell was once again untouchable. At his side, Charlotte was a vision of ethereal perfection. She wore a gown of floor-length white silk, her blonde hair styled simply with a single pearl pin. She played the part of the devoted Duchess with such seamless elegance that the tongue whispered she was the finest acquisition of the season. Sebastian felt the weight of their envy, and it fed his pride. He moved from group to group, basking in the praise of earls and viscounts who had once crossed the street to avoid his father's creditors. Charlotte, sensing his desire to dominate the floor, excused herself to find a glass of lemonade, slipping quietly into the shadows of the velvet-draped gallery that overlooked the grand hall. She was tired. The year of fixing his estate in secret, of enduring his coldness, and of being treated like a ghost had drained the color from her spirit. She leaned against a marble pillar, the cool stone a relief against her skin, and closed her eyes for a fleeting second of peace. That was when she heard his voice. It was a rich, confident baritone, cutting through the low hum of the ballroom from a secluded alcove just behind the drapery. Sebastian was holding court with a small circle of his oldest, most cynical friends. "You've done it, Hartwell," the Marquis of Belvington chuckled, his voice thick with brandy. "Saved the hall, cleared the name, and secured the finest estate in the north, and all it cost you was a ring and a merchant's daughter." Charlotte's breath hitched. She froze, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "A small price for a man of my standing," Sebastian replied. There was a smirk in his voice that Charlotte could visualize without even looking. "The girl is pleasant enough, I suppose. She keeps the house quiet and doesn't make demands. But let us be honest amongst friends, she was a necessary investment, and perhaps my most expensive one. Dull as dishwater, of course, but she serves the purpose of keeping the Hartwell crest from the mud." "A dull investment," Another voice tittered, "I heard she's quite the beauty." "Beauty is a commodity, like cotton or grain," Sebastian said, his tone dropping into a chilling, dismissive drawl. "I needed her father's gold to fix the roof. I didn't need a wife to fill my heart. She is a replacement for the fortune I lost, nothing more. Once she has provided an heir, she can spend her days in the gardens for all I care. I have my title back, and that is the only marriage that matters." The men laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that seemed to shatter the very air in the gallery. Charlotte didn't move. She didn't drop her glass, though her hand shook with a violence that made the liquid ripple. Each word had been a precise, surgical strike against the woman she had tried to be for him. She had saved his heritage. She had worked until her eyes ached to ensure he never felt the sting of poverty again. She had loved him in the silence, hoping that one day he would see the person beneath the Duchess. Now she saw the truth. To him, she was a transaction. She was a piece of equipment used to repair a broken house, a dull tool to be put back in the chest once the job was done. She turned away from the alcove, her white silk gown whispering against the floor like the wings of a trapped bird. She didn't head back to the ballroom. She didn't look for Sebastian to demand an apology. Instead, she walked toward the cloakroom, her head held higher than it had ever been. The investment was done being managed. As she stepped out into the biting winter night to call for a separate carriage, the cold air felt like a benediction. Sebastian had said she was dull, a replacement for the freedom he had lost. As the carriage door closed, Charlotte realized that for the first time in a year, she was the only one in the Hartwell marriage who was truly free. Sebastian had his title, and he had his palace. But as the lights of the gala faded behind her, she knew he had just lost the only thing in his life that hadn't been for sale. Change did not arrive with a scream or a shattered vase. It arrived with a silence so profound it began to ring in Sebastian's ears. In the weeks following the gala, the invisible machinery that had kept Hartwell Hall humming with life began to grind to a halt. At first, the Duke was too preoccupied with his own reflection in the social mirror to notice the subtle decay. He simply assumed the tea tasted bitter because the leaves were old, and the fire in his study gutted out because the wood was damp. He did not realize that the spirit of the house had simply stopped trying to keep him warm. The first true tremor in his foundation occurred on a Monday morning. Sebastian sat at his desk, reaching habitually for the leather-bound ledger that Charlotte usually left there, neatly balanced and marked with small, precise notes on the week's expenditures. The desk was empty. Not only were the books missing, but his tea, usually brewed to the exact amber strength he preferred, had not been brought. When he finally summoned the butler, the man appeared flustered and confused. "Her Grace did not give the order for the morning service, Your Grace," the man stammered. She informed us that she was occupied with her own correspondence and that you would likely prefer to manage your own affairs from now on." Sebastian's brow furrowed. Occupied? What could she possibly be occupied with? He dismissed the servant with a sharp wave, feeling a prickle of annoyance. He went to find her, intending to remind her of her duties, but when he passed her in the hallway, the woman he encountered was a stranger. Charlotte was dressed in a gown of deep, charcoal silk, a color far too somber for the bright morning, but it was the way the fabric moved that caught his eye. There was a peculiar weight to her skirts, a stiff rustle that suggested something sturdier than petticoats beneath. He didn't know that under her finery, Charlotte was already wearing her traveling boots and a sturdy wool habit. She was a woman living in a state of permanent departure, a bird perched on a branch, waiting for the exact moment the wind turned. "Charlotte," he called out, his voice echoing in the marble corridor. "The ledgers are missing, and the tea was cold." She stopped and turned, but she did not look at him with the soft, searching gaze of a woman hopping for a kind word. Her eyes were as flat and cold as a winter lake. "I imagine a man of your standing, so capable of restoring a family legacy, can surely manage a teapot and a pen, Sebastian. I have retired from the accounting business. It was, as you said, quite dull." The mention of the word dull hit him like a physical blow, a ghost of his own voice echoing back from the gala. He opened his mouth to retort, to demand she return to her station, but she had already turned away, the heavy silk of her skirts masking the purposeful stride of her boots. As the days bled into a week, the silent shift became a localized earthquake. Sebastian discovered that without Charlotte's quiet intervention, the estate was a labyrinth he didn't know how to navigate. The local baker stopped delivering because the contract hadn't been renewed. The head stableman came to him with questions about the spring breeding that Sebastian couldn't answer, and the very air in the palace grew stale and thick with dust. He began to watch her, a strange and frantic jealousy taking root in his chest. He would see her in the library, not reading his family's history, but studying maps of the coast and schedules for the steamships departing from the docks. She no longer sat at the end of the table during dinner. She ate in her rooms, leaving him to face the vast, empty mahogany desert alone. He noticed that she was systematically thinning her presence in the house. Her favorite vases were empty, her embroidery hoops were gone, the small, personal trinkets that had once given the cold stone rooms a sense of home were being packed away into trunks he wasn't supposed to see. Every time he saw her, she seemed more vibrant, her spine straighter, her beauty more cutting, yet she felt miles away, as if she were already a memory while still standing in the room. He didn't know how to bridge the distance. He had spent a year teaching her that she didn't matter, and now that she had finally believed him, he found he couldn't breathe in the vacuum she left behind. The Duke was still the master of Hartwell Hall, but as he sat in his cold study, staring at the tea he had brewed himself, too dark, too bitter, he realized the investment had withdrawn its capital, and he was staring into the face of a bankruptcy that no amount of gold could ever fix. The house did not just feel cold, it felt abandoned, as if the very stone of Hartwell Hall were mourning a loss it couldn't quite name. Sebastian stood in the center of the grand foyer, his breath hitching in a plume of white mist. The furnaces were stoked, and the hearths were piled high with oak, yet a bone-deep chill permeated the air, a silence that carried the weight of a tomb. For the first time in his life, the Duke found himself wandering his own home like a trespasser, searching for a spark that had nothing to do with fire. He found himself standing outside Charlotte's morning room, a place he had avoided for a year because it smelled too much of her presence. He pushed the door open, expecting to find her bent over a book or arranging flowers, but the room was stripped bare. The sunlight hit the floor in harsh, unforgiving rectangles, highlighting the pale circles on the wallpaper where her paintings had once hung. The absence was violent. It wasn't just that she wasn't there, it was that she had taken the soul of the room with her. Sebastian walked to her desk and ran a hand over the polished wood. For months, he had told himself she was a replacement, a placeholder for the life he deserved, but as he stood in the hollowed-out space she had occupied, he felt a sharp, sudden shiver that had nothing to do with the Derbyshire winter. He missed her, not the Duchess, not the manager of his accounts, but the woman. He missed the way her white silk skirts whispered against the stone, a soft rhythm that had become the heartbeat of his house. He missed the quiet, steady strength in her gaze, a gaze he had spent a year avoiding because he was afraid of what it would see in him. He realized then that his independence was a lie. He had played at being the untouchable sovereign of his estate, but he had been leaning on her strength like a crutch while pretending he was walking alone. He thought back to the gala, to the cruel words he had spat out to impress men he didn't even like, and the memory felt like a hot coal in his throat. He had called her dull. He had called her an investment. A sudden, desperate need to see her seized him. He hurried toward the west wing, his boots echoing with a lonely, frantic hollow sound. He burst into the small library where she often spent her afternoons, but the chair by the window was empty. He checked the gardens, the conservatory, even the kitchens, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that felt entirely unnoble. The house was growing colder by the minute, the shadows stretching long and thin across the marble floors. He found himself standing in front of her portrait in the gallery, the one he had commissioned only to satisfy protocol. He looked at the painted Charlotte, with her ethereal blonde hair and her resolute expression, and for the first time, he saw the woman behind the title. He saw the loneliness he had inflicted on her. He saw the resilience that had kept his family name from the dirt. Charlotte, he whispered, the name feeling strange and heavy on his tongue. There was no answer, only the wind rattling the high, leaded windows and the settle of the old house. Sebastian realized with a terrifying clarity that he had spent his life guarding a title that couldn't love him, while the only woman who could had become a ghost before she had even left. He wasn't the master of Hartwell Hall. He was a prisoner in a museum of his own making, and the only person with the key was a woman he had spent every day making sure he didn't deserve. The first shiver of true fear raced down his spine. He didn't just miss her. He was terrified of a world where she no longer existed. The end did not come with a storm, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a clock striking midnight. Sebastian was in his study, staring at a blank sheet of stationery, trying to find the words to bridge a gap he had spent a year widening, when the door opened. Charlotte walked in, but she did not hover at the threshold like a ghost this time. She moved with a terrifying, absolute presence. She was already wearing her heavy traveling cloak of midnight blue, the hood pushed back to reveal a face that was as calm and clear as a winter morning. She did not wait for him to speak. She walked directly to his massive oak desk, the altar where he had sacrificed her to his family legacy, and placed a stack of parchment on the blotter. On top of the papers, she set the gold wedding band. The small, metallic clink of the ring against the wood sounded like a gavel striking a bench, final and unyielding. Sebastian looked down, his heart stalling in his chest. The parchment wasn't a ledger or a request for funds. They were annulment papers, already signed in her elegant, flowing script. The ink was dry. The decision was old. "What is this, Charlotte?" he asked, his voice cracking, betraying the Duke's carefully constructed mask. "The end of the transaction, Sebastian," she replied. Her voice was steady, devoid of the heat of anger or the tremor of grief. That was what terrified him most. There were no tears to wipe away, no fury to soothe. She had simply moved beyond him. "I have stayed exactly 1 year. In that time I have cleared your debts, restored your lands, and ensured your staff is loyal and your house is whole. I have fulfilled every unspoken requirement of my dowry." "Charlotte, listen to me," he said, rising from his chair, his hands trembling. "I know what I said at the gala. I was a fool, a man blinded by—" "You weren't a fool," she interrupted gently, and the kindness in her tone was more devastating than a scream. "You were honest. You wanted a replacement for your lost fortune, and I wanted a life where I was seen for who I am. We both failed to get what we truly desired. You have your title back, Sebastian. It is polished, it is prestigious, and it is entirely yours once again. I am taking back my name, as it is the only thing I have left that you haven't tried to put a price on." She looked at him then, and for the first time, Sebastian saw the full depth of the woman he had ignored. She wasn't a merchant's daughter playing at being a duchess. She was a sovereign in her own right, leaving a kingdom that was too small for her spirit. "I saved your title," she said, her gaze holding his until he was forced to look away from the sheer weight of his own regret. "Now I am saving myself. Thank you for the lessons, Your Grace. It turns out the Hartwell legacy is exactly as you described it, grand, ancient, and perfectly hollow." She turned toward the door, the heavy wool of her cloak swirling around her boots. "Charlotte, wait," he called out, reaching across the desk as if he could catch the fading light. "I don't want the title, not like this." She paused at the door, but she didn't look back. "Then you should have realized that a year ago. Goodbye, Sebastian. I hope the silence of your halls is everything you hoped it would be." She stepped out, and a moment later, the front door of the palace thudded shut. The sound echoed through the stone corridors, vibrating in the floorboards beneath Sebastian's feet. He looked down at the desk, at the cold gold of the ring and the white finality of the papers. He was the Duke of Hartwell. He was the master of all he surveyed. And as the silence he had once demanded settled over him like a shroud, he realized he was standing in the center of a grave he had dug with his own pride. The thud of the front door was not just a sound. It was the final nail in the coffin of Sebastian's arrogance. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen in the candlelit shadows of his study, staring at the empty gold circle on his desk. Then, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath carriage wheels sliced through the silence. The sound acted like a spark to dry tinder. A primal, frantic terror, the kind that no duke was ever supposed to feel, erupted in his chest, shattering the icy composure he had worn like armor for 30 years. He didn't grab his hat. He didn't call for his valet. He bolted from the room, his heavy boots thundering against the marble floors of the gallery. As he reached the grand foyer, he caught a glimpse of the guests he had invited for a formal evening of cards, local gentry and minor lords who stood huddled in small, whispering groups. They stared in stunned silence as their host, the famously stoic Duke of Hartwell, tore past them with his cravat undone and his hair wildly disheveled. He didn't see them. He didn't care about the scandal that would undoubtedly be the talk of the county by dawn. "Charlotte," he roared, his voice cracking as he threw open the massive oak doors. The storm had broken in earnest. A wall of freezing rain and wind slammed into him, but he didn't flinch. He descended the stone steps in a blurred rush, his polished leather boots skidding on the slick surface. By the time he hit the driveway, the carriage was already 50 yards away, a dark, hulking shape being swallowed by the grey mist and the torrential downpour. Stop the carriage." He began to run. The transition was violent and total. The Duke, the man of velvet and highborn pride, vanished into the mud. Within seconds, his expensive navy tailcoat was splattered with filth, the heavy fabric soaking up the rainwater until it weighed him down like a leaden shroud. He didn't slow. He sprinted through the sludge of the drive, his lungs burning with the intake of icy air. His heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked down for a split second as he stumbled, seeing his white lace cravat, a symbol of his status, dragged through the muck. In any other moment, the sight would have mortified him. Now he felt a strange, liberating rage. He tore the lace from his neck and cast it into the wind, shedding the last remnants of the Duke persona. He wasn't a Hartwell in this moment. He was simply a man who had realized too late that he had let his entire world drive away in a black box on wheels. The carriage accelerated as it hit the main road, the horses' hooves throwing up plumes of muddy water. Sebastian pushed his body past its breaking point, his feet slipping and sliding in the mire. He fell once hard, his hands plunging deep into the freezing slush, the grit of the earth biting into his palms. He scrambled up immediately, his face smeared with dirt and rain, his eyes fixed on the flickering red lanterns of the retreating coach. "Charlotte, please," he screamed, but the wind snatched the words from his lips and tore them to shreds. He was losing her. The gap between them was widening, a physical manifestation of the year he had spent pushing her away. Every step he took through the mud felt like a penance for every cold word he had ever spoken. He saw the carriage reach the edge of the estate, the iron gates looming like the bars of a cage he had built for himself. If she passed those gates, he knew with a soul-crushing certainty that she would never look back. His legs gave way just as the carriage rounded the bend, the lights disappearing behind a thicket of ancient oaks. Sebastian collapsed to his knees in the center of the road, the rain washing the mud from his face only to replace it with fresh tears. He sat there in the filth, a broken king in a kingdom of shadows, clutching the wet earth as if he could hold onto the land since he couldn't hold on to her. He had saved the stones, he had saved the gold, he had saved the title. But as he knelt in the darkness, shivering and stripped of his dignity, he realized that the only thing that had ever made Hartwell Hall a home was currently vanishing into the night, and he was finally, truly alone. The port of Hull was a chaotic symphony of iron, salt, and steam, but to Sebastian, it felt like the edge of the world. He had ridden through the night, pushing his horse until the animal's breath came in ragged plumes of white mist, his own body numb from the freezing rain that had turned his fine clothes into a sodden, muddy weight. He did not look like a duke. His hair was a matted mess, his face was gaunt with exhaustion, and his hands were stained with the grit of the road. He looked like a man who had lost everything, which was the only honest thing about him. He spotted her near the gangplank of the SS Victoria, a ship bound for the distant shores of her father's shipping empire. Charlotte was a vision of steady, quiet resolve amidst the frantic bustle of departing passengers. She was dressed in her traveling habit, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a dark bonnet. She looked toward the horizon, not behind her, as if the life she had lived at Hartwell Hall had already been folded up and put away like an old, discarded ribbon. "Charlotte!" The cry tore from his throat, raw and unpolished. She paused, her hand frozen on the railing. When she turned, her expression wasn't one of joy or even anger. It was a profound, weary surprise. She watched as the Duke of Hartwell stumbled toward her, pushing through a crowd of porters and sailors who had no idea they were standing in the way of a peer of the realm. "Sebastian," she whispered as he reached her, his chest heaving, "what have you done to yourself?" He didn't answer with a boast or a command. He didn't mention the estate, the lineage, or the scandal of his appearance. Instead, he did something that the Hartwell bloodline had not done in 4 centuries. He fell to his knees in the salt-stained timber of the docks. "Don't go," he rasped, his voice breaking. "Please, if you leave, the lights in the hall don't just go out, they cease to matter. I spent a year telling you that you were a replacement for my fortune, but I was the one who was hollow. I was a man built of stone and titles, and I didn't realize until you walked out that you weren't the one who needed saving. I was. Charlotte looked down at him, her eyes searching his face. The title is safe, Sebastian. The debt is gone. You have exactly what you married me for. I don't want the title, he cried, the words echoing against the iron hull of the ship. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold band, holding it up with a hand that shook uncontrollably. I want the woman who balanced my books when I was too proud to look at them. I want the woman who filled a cold house with light while I was busy being a ghost. I'm not asking you to come back as a duchess. I'm asking you to come back for me, for the man who is nothing without you. The steam whistle of the ship let out a deafening, mournful blast, signaling the final call for boarding. The crowd surged around them, but the space between Sebastian and Charlotte felt like a sanctuary of absolute silence. He looked up at her, his eyes wet with a mixture of salt spray and tears, offering her the ring, not as a shackle, but as a plea. Charlotte looked at the ring, then at the broken, mud-stained man at her feet. For a long moment, the only sound was the lapping of the dark water against the pier. Then slowly, she reached down. She didn't take the ring immediately. Instead, she placed her hand against his cheek, her touch warm against his frozen skin. "You're a fool, Sebastian Hartwell," she whispered, a small, sad smile finally breaking through her resolve. "You've ruined a perfectly good tailcoat." "I'll burn them all," he promised, a desperate hope flaring in his chest. "I'll burn every stitch of velvet I own if it means you'll stay." She didn't board the ship. She took the ring from his palm and slipped it back onto her finger, but this time, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like a choice. As she helped him to his feet, the sun began to break through the heavy Derbyshire clouds, casting a golden light over the grime of the docks. Sebastian realized then that he had spent his life protecting things that couldn't love him back, while neglecting the only thing that could. He was still a duke, but as he held Charlotte's hand, he knew that his true nobility didn't come from his name. It came from the woman who had finally taught him how to be a man. The carriage ride back to Hartwell Hall was quiet, but the silence was no longer a tomb, it was a beginning. The palace still stood on the hill, grand and ancient, but as they passed through the iron gates, Sebastian didn't see a fortress to be guarded. He saw a home, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the stones. He was looking at the woman beside him, knowing that while titles could be inherited and gold could be won, a heart like hers was the only thing in the world that was truly irreplaceable. The story concludes at the windswept harbor as the sun finally breaks through the storm clouds. Sebastian reaches Charlotte just as she prepares to board, falling to his knees not as a duke, but as a man stripped of his pretenses. He confesses that the palace is merely cold stone and his title is nothing but hollow ink without her presence to give them meaning. Seeing him humbled and broken in the mud, Charlotte realizes the power has shifted entirely. She is no longer a replacement, but his equal, choosing to return not for the crown he wears, but for the man he has finally become. The moral of this tale reminds us of the true nature of value. While a title can be inherited and wealth can be married into, a soulmate is the only treasure that remains truly irreplaceable once it is lost. The story serves as a testament to the fact that true nobility is found in humility, and that real wealth isn't measured by the gold on your finger, but by the devotion of the person who holds your hand. If you believe the Duke got exactly what he deserved, or if you're rooting for Charlotte's newfound independence, give this story a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to join us for more tales of Victorian romance, regret, and justice. Comment below, if you were in Charlotte's shoes, would you have given him a second chance, or would you have left him standing alone in the rain?